A related problem is the fact that during his years in London, the great playwright was virtually invisible. Shakespeare is supposed to have spent roughly 20 years in London, but we cannot find a single record during that whole 20-year stretch of anyone seeing the great actor and playwright in the flesh. When people saw the famous actor Richard Burbage or met the playwright Ben Jonson, they marked it down as a notable event. But if anyone in London during the whole 20 years of his greatest prominence saw Shakespeare on stage, or discussed poetry with him, or corresponded with him, or met him at a party or on the street, they did not think the encounter worthy of mention. The only plausible explanation for the above facts is that the name William Shakespeare was a pseudonym used by the author in a successful attempt to keep his identity secret, and that those persons who did meet the author therefore did not know they were meeting the great William Shakespeare. Obviously, Shakespeare, whose name was so similar, could not have successfully hidden behind such a pen name. Perhaps an even graver difficulty with the official story is the attitude towards Shakespeare in Stratford on Avon. Though Shakespeare is supposed to have been the greatest writer in England and a well known actor to boot, nobody in his hometown seemed to be aware that he was a famous man, nor that there was anything unusual about him. This is even more amazing when one recalls that he was poor when he left Stratford and wealthy when he returned, a change which would naturally tend to make friends and neighbors curious. Yet the fact is that during his lifetime, not one of his friends or neighbors in Stratford, not even his own family, ever referred to Shakespeare as an actor, a playwright, a poet, or a literary figure of any sort. Well, what about the manuscripts of the plays in Shakespeare's own handwriting? Surely they prove that he was the author. Unfortunately, there are no manuscripts of the play in his handwriting, or any early drafts, or any fragments, or any unpublished or unfinished works. In fact, aside from six signatures on legal documents, there is nothing in his handwriting. No notes, no notebooks, no memoranda, no diaries, not a single personal letter by him survives. Not a single Not a single business letter. Judging from the record, it appears that Shakespeare, far from being an author, was barely literate or even illiterate. A related point is that Shakespeare's parents, wife, and children were all illiterate. Now, a man does not choose his parents, and he might select a maid for reasons other than her reading ability, but it seems scarcely believable that a man to whom the written word meant so much would allow his own daughters to grow up unable to read and write. If Shakespeare was indeed Shakespeare, then he is the only prominent author in history whose children are known to have been illiterate. Then there is the question of Shakespeare's will. The original document survives. It is 3 pages long and lists his property in considerable detail, with many specific bequests. Nowhere does it mention any poem, any plays, any manuscripts, any works in progress, or any literary rights. Nor does it make mention of any personal books or papers. There is no hint that he would like to see his remaining plays published, although at least 20 of them had not yet appeared in print, or that he had ever written a play or poem in his life. It is the will of an unschooled, possibly illiterate merchant. We might also note that in an era when the English poets typically arranged gaudy funerals and composed lengthy poetic eulogies when one of their members died, the death of Shakespeare in 1616 went completely unmentioned by every writer in England. Not even Ben Jonson, who later claimed to have been a great admirer and friend of William Shakespeare, expressed the slightest regret when Shakespeare died. or mention the event at all. Clearly, the other poets of the day saw no connection between the Stratford man and the great playwright. To my mind, the foregoing arguments are already conclusive, and no further proof is needed that Shakespeare was not the playwright and that William Shakespeare was a pseudonym used to conceal the true author's identity. However, there are additional strong arguments against Shakespeare being the author, although their persuasiveness is not crucial to the case against him. For example, it has been pointed out that most dramatists and writers of fiction include in their writings many incidents from their own lives. Often, such events form a major part of the story, but the plays of Shakespeare are virtually devoid of any incidents or circumstances which can be traced back to Shakespeare's own experiences. Another argument is that the author, William Shakespeare, was obviously an extremely well educated man. Witness his enormous vocabulary, much larger than that of any other playwright, his familiarity with both Latin and French, his accurate knowledge of legal terminology, and his voluminous knowledge of classical literature. But everyone agreed that Shakespeare never attended a university, and as explained above, it is doubtful whether he even attended grammar school. Still, another point is that Shakespeare, the author, seems to be of aristocratic sympathies and background, very familiar with the sports of the aristocracy such as fox hunting and falconry, and familiar with court life and court intrigues. Shakespeare, on the other hand, came from a small town and had a petite bourgeois background. There are many other aspects of the life of Shakespeare that do not fit in with the hypothesis that he was the famous author. William Shakespeare and I could easily write many pages describing additional difficulties with that theory. Of course, orthodox biographers have constructed hypothetical explanations for each of those difficulties. And for each of the problems I have already described, some of those explanations are rather unlikely, but each one individually is at least possible. For example, it is possible, although people tend to save letters that they receive from famous men, that by the merest coincidence, every personal or business letter that Shakespeare ever wrote has vanished without a trace, together with all his notes, notebooks, and manuscripts. It is possible that the greatest of English poets composed for his own epitaph the childish piece of doggerel that we see on Shakespeare's gravestone. It is possible that a man whose plays show that he admired intelligent, educated women let his own daughters grow up illiterate. And it is possible that although Shakespeare was the most celebrated writer in England, not a single one of his friends, family, or neighbors in Stratford ever referred to him as an actor, poet, or playwright. It's not very likely, but it's possible. However, in this case, as in most, the whole is greater than any of its parts. Were there just one or two difficulties with the official story, we might accept even rather far fetched explanations for them. But after a while, we can't help noticing that nothing seems to fit the official story naturally. Everything about that story seems to require an ad hoc and often far fetched explanation. The problem is that William Shakespeare of Stratford on Avon was a barely literate small town merchant, and neither his education, nor his character, nor his actions, nor what his family and neighbors said about him are consistent with his being the great author, William Shakespeare. Well, if Shakespeare was not the author of the plays, who was? Many other persons have been suggested, of which the best known is the famous philosopher Francis Bacon. But in recent years, the accumulation of evidence has swung opinion strongly towards Edward de Vere. We know a lot about Edward de Vere. He led an adventurous life, and many events in his life are mirrored in the plays. He was born in 1550, the son and heir of the 16th Earl of Oxford, a wealthy and high ranking aristocrat. As befit the heir to a title which went back to the Norman conquest, young Edward received training in all the customary skills of a young lord: riding, hunting, military arts, and also such milder pursuits as music and dancing. Nor was his academic education ignored. He had private tutors for both French and Latin, as well as other subjects. Eventually, he obtained a bachelor's degree from Cambridge University and a master's degree from Oxford. Afterwards, he studied law for a year at Gray's Inn, one of the famed inns of court in London. His father died when Edward was only 12, and his mother subsequently remarried. However, Edward did not remain with his mother for long. Instead, he became a royal ward, and a guardian was appointed for him. The guardian chosen was William Cecil, Lord Treasurer of England and a member of Queen Elizabeth's Privy Council for many years. As the Queen's oldest and most trusted advisor, Cecil was one of the most powerful men in England. Young de Vere, as befitted his high rank, was treated as a family member in Cecil's household. A somewhat mysterious incident in which he killed one of Cecil's servants was kept out of the court due to Cecil's influence. In his late teens, he was introduced to court, where he met all the leading figures, including the Queen herself. She was much taken with the young man, who, in addition to being brilliant, athletic, and charming, was also very good looking, and he soon became a favorite of hers. When he was 21, De Vere married Anne Cecil, his guardian's daughter, since they had been reared together and she was almost his kid sister. Such as marriage was quite unusual. But Posthumus Leonatus, the hero of Cymbeline, was also a royal ward who married his guardian's daughter, and there are many other resemblances between his story and De Vere's. When he was 24, De Vere embarked on a lengthy trip through Europe. He visited France and Germany, spent about 10 months in Italy, and then returned to England through France. On the trip back across the English Channel, his ship was attacked by pirates, who planned to hold their captives for ransom. But De Vere informed the pirates of his personal friendship with Queen Elizabeth, and the pirates decided it was prudent to release him promptly without demanding a ransom. Meanwhile, his wife Anne had given birth to a daughter. Though the girl had been born only 8 months after De Vere left England, he insisted that the child was not his, and claiming that Anne was an adulteress. He refused to live with her. Most historians feel that his charge was ill founded. Apparently, De Vere eventually reached this conclusion also, as after a 5 year separation, he dropped his charges and resumed living with Anne. During the 5 year separation from his wife, De Vere had an affair with a court lady, which resulted in her pregnancy. Queen Elizabeth, angered at this, had De Vere arrested and sent to the Tower of London. He was released after a few months, but a friend of the young woman, resentful of De Vere's action, attacked him, and De Vere was badly injured. Street brawls between the two families continued for a while, until the Queen threatened to jail them all unless the fighting stopped. Reminds one of Romeo and Juliet. After De Vere resumed living with his wife, they had 5 children together. Then Anne, still only 32 years old, died suddenly. 4 years later, De Vere remarried, and his second wife outlived him. Meanwhile, De Vere's financial affairs, which had been in bad shape due to his spendthrift habits, had improved radically. In 1586, when De Vere was 36 years old, Queen Elizabeth granted him a lifetime pension in the extraordinary amount of £1,000 a year. That is equivalent to about 100,000 a year today, tax free. A remarkable sum, especially considering that Elizabeth was notoriously tight fisted with money. Curiously, the grant made no mention of any duties which De Vere must perform in return. nor of any past services for which he was being rewarded. The grant, however, was paid regularly for the rest of her life, and her successor, King James I, continued to pay it after her death in 1603. De Vere had always been intensely interested in poetry and the theatre, was friends with many literary figures, and as a young man is known to have written poetry and plays in his own name. Those early plays have been lost, but several of the poems survive. Some of them are quite good, though well below the standard of the mature William Shakespeare. However, he did not publish any of them due to the prevailing notion that it was discreditable for an aristocrat to write poetry for publication. Such an attitude seems very peculiar nowadays, but historians agree that such an attitude was common at the time and that the taboo was rarely violated. After the grant by Queen Elizabeth, though, De Vere never wrote another line in his own name, but within a few years, poems and plays started appearing by the invisible author William Shakespeare. Why did Elizabeth grant his extraordinary genius pension to De Vere? Although no reason was ever stated, the obvious explanation is that she, like so many other monarchs before her, was patronizing a talented artist in the hopes that his achievements would glorify her reign. If that was her motive, she certainly got her money's worth. Indeed, no ruler before or since seems to have made a better choice. After being awarded the pension by the Queen, the formerly very active Edward de Vere retired completely from court life. Presumably, he spent the last 18 years of his life writing and revising the great plays and poetry that have made William Shakespeare famous. He died in 1604 during an epidemic of the plague and was buried near his country home at Hackney, near the village of Stratford. Unlike Shakespeare or any of the other persons suggested as the author, Edward de Vere seems to fit perfectly the requirements for the mysterious William Shakespeare. He had an excellent education, had studied law, and was well versed in foreign languages. He certainly knew Latin and French and possibly other languages as well. He was an aristocrat and had an insider's knowledge of court life and court intrigue. He had the large amount of free time necessary to compose the plays. He was repeatedly described by others as brilliant and talented. He had a lifelong interest in the theatre and is known to have written poetry and plays in his own name when he was younger. Indeed, he was specifically named during his lifetime as one of those noblemen who had written poetry, but because of the taboo mentioned above, had not published it under his own name. Moreover, he was praised as the most skillful and excellent of the gentlemen who had done so. The plays of William Shakespeare contain a large number of incidents and characters which can be clearly identified as relating to events, personalities, and situations in the life of Edward de Vere. The only problem at all with accepting de Vere as the author of the plays is the question, why did he keep his identity a secret? There are several possible explanations. 1. There was a strong taboo at the time against noblemen writing poetry for publication or plays for the commercial theatre. Number 2. De Vere was known to be an insider at court. Since many of the plays dealt with court life, if he admitted authorship, people would naturally and probably correctly have assumed that various characters in the plays were intended as insulting parodies of various real people in court. Today, such writing is accepted as commonplace, and though hardly friendly, not a cause for action. By the standards of those days, however, it would at least have been grounds for a lawsuit, and more likely for a duel. By hiding its identity, De Vere avoided such problems. Number 3. Many of the sonnets of William Shakespeare are addressed to a female lover. His admission of authorship, therefore, would be embarrassing to his wife. Number 4. Far worse, many of the other sonnets are addressed to a male and have often been interpreted as showing that the author was homosexual or bisexual. Whether or not that interpretation is correct, admitting that he was the author of the sonnets would have caused gossip that would have been very embarrassing to his family. Perhaps no one of these answers is entirely convincing by itself. Taken together, though they might indeed be the full explanation for De Vere's concealing his identity, however, it is certainly possible that he had additional reasons which we do not know of. For example, it is possible that, as a condition of the pension granted him, Elizabeth had insisted that he follow the social norms and avoid possible duels between her courtiers by not publishing anything in his own name. Whether or not we know the full explanation for De Vere's concealing his authorship, he matches the requirements for Shakespeare perfectly in all other aspects. And remember, nobody else even comes close. To me, it seems virtually certain that he is the author. One final question: how did Shakespeare ever get to be considered the author of the plays? That belief seems to have its origin in three references, each made a few years after Shakespeare had died and each somewhat ambiguous. Unless an unusual coincidence is postulated, it appears that someone or once deliberately committed a hoax. Why was that done and by whom? We cannot be certain of the answer to that question, but the most likely explanation is that the hoax was perpetrated by De Vere's family when they decided to have his collected works published and chose to continue to keep his identity secret. Their motives were probably quite similar to his fear of scandal and perhaps other motives, such as a promise to the monarch. To make the deception more complete, they decided to present another person as the author. Shakespeare was the obvious choice as the stand in, because of the similarity of names. Also, since he had been dead for several years, he could not expose the fraud, and since he was little known in London and even less remembered, there were very few others in town who would realize that the story was a hoax. The deception was probably fairly easy to carry out. Ben Jonson, who provided a prefatory poem to the first folio edition, was persuaded to include a couple of ambiguous lines that strongly hinted, without saying so directly, or telling any other flat on lies, that the author came from Stratford on Avon. They also arranged for a monument to be erected there near Shakespeare's grave, with an inscription which includes strong, though vague words of praise. Since the identity of William Shakespeare had always been kept a secret, a few hints that he was the man from Stratford sufficed to get the story started. Nobody at the time was very interested in checking the story carefully. There was much less interest in literary biography than there is now. By the time the first biography of Shakespeare was written, those who knew the truth had long been dead, and the myth of Shakespeare authorship long accepted.